All right, not a lot of fun and games today. We're going to jump right in. I did a live the day after the election where Donald Trump became only the second president in American history to win a non-consecutive term by convincingly beating Kamala Harris, and emotions were high, limited information was available. But based on what I had seen and what I had been hearing at that time, I made the proclamation in this live that the core reason Kamala Harris lost her bid for presidency of the United States was misogyny and racism. I base this not just on my general beliefs on the pervasiveness of sexism and racism in this country, but on the fact that at the time, the early data indicated that there was a huge decrease in voter turnout for her specifically with rural and suburban white men. Many folks, including more moderate leftists and liberals, agreed with this take, but also disagreed with the take. Others that I would call my peers politically, and some even further left than I, felt like this take was erroneous and in some ways let the Democrats off the hook for their many mistakes, many mistakes during this election cycle. Or like their liberals, ironically, they didn't like the finger being pointed at white people when there's black men, Latino men, and Palestinians to take the blame. I found both of these responses frustrating as neither really aligned with how I saw the whole situation, but at the time I didn't have enough data and I hadn't talked to enough people to feel too confident in my own take. But now, some weeks later, as most of the details and info are near final, along with being able to observe and process a lot of other people's opinions in the aftermath, I want to return to this opinion with a little more data. That's what we'll be doing in this video, using a mostly data-driven approach to explain why Kamala Harris lost, or better yet, why Donald Trump won, and what lessons could and should be learned from this election. I want to first make a few things clear. Here in the swing state of Georgia where I live, I voted for Kamala Harris. I didn't do this out of an alignment to the politics that Kamala represented or ran on, especially in the latter part of her campaign. I didn't do this with the mythical hope that she would be pushed left. That just doesn't really happen. I voted for Kamala Harris because of the two devils I was faced with. I preferred her, the devil I knew. To many, that is unsatisfactory. And to those of you who feel this way, it is what it is. To me, the world is already in a hellscape situation, and I personally find no solace in the individual victory that would have been a protest or third-party vote, nor did I think that it would make a difference, and we'll look at why that's completely true later on. I am not of the mind that a Trump presidency and a Kamala Harris presidency would have been indiscernible from each other. On a grand scale, that's likely true, but at a micro level, at an interpersonal level, and at an immediate level, I think this is demonstrably false, and I don't think anyone who's serious can say that to be a fact across the board. Trump's 4 years as president before were harmful in numerous ways that were unique to him, including his handling of a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, which was made worse by his incompetence. But I digress. I'm only bringing this up because I also don't want this video to be mistaken as a defense for Kamala Harris or the Democrats. And it's really frustrating that our political discourse on the left has been so atomized and just made into content garbage that people who take nuanced look at these complex issues end up having to be in one camp or another. Like, I'm literally in the moment have done this take like 10 times because I'm trying to find the words to say how frustrating it is to want to have a nuanced conversation around electoralism when there's people that if you don't support Kamala Harris, they don't want to hear anything you want to say, even though there's obvious reasons to not support Kamala Harris. And people that don't support Kamala Harris feel like there's no logical or moral reason to vote for her regardless, as if anything in our political reality is that black and white. But it is what it is. I feel like it's important to continue challenging my more liberal and moderate audience to dispose of the belief that Democrats are on our side. At best, they hold us hostage and force us to be complicit in their failings and atrocities by holding the knife to our throat that is the Republican Party. But I also think the grandstanding and finger wagging, often by people who are least affected by the threat that is the Republican Party, is just as ridiculous, especially when that ideology veers into, I'll just call it magical thinking at this point. But for those who still don't understand why the Democrats are bad, I'll link some other videos that break down their failings in the description. With that out of the way, let's get to it. As of writing, with 99% of the vote in nationwide, Kamala Harris has 73,879,941 votes, and Trump has 76,528,802 votes. This ranks second and fourth all time in popular votes for president. And this is with 90 million eligible voters deciding to stay home, which, believe it or not, is typical for non-voters. Usually voter turnout is around 60 to 65%. However, one important detail that we'll come back to a few times is that in 2020, Joe Biden set the record for popular votes with 81 million votes. The important fact to point out here is that Kamala Harris got around 7 million votes less than Joe Biden did back in 2020 nationwide. Now, you might immediately look at that and say this is because Kamala ran a bad campaign and because she campaigned on the wrong things that her base and regular people did not care about. Or you may immediately look and say that Kamala is a victim of sexism and racism because the same people that voted for Biden, whose campaign was exactly like hers, did not vote for her. And I think when you're looking at it at a national level, it's hard to be definitive because we're talking about all 50 states, many with complex dynamics of how voting plays out. There's reasons to think that Kamala failed to inspire nationwide with a campaign that started late, where American people didn't get to choose her, and her campaign was not overly detailed on policy. And the stuff that was emphasized showed her to be a centrist and a moderate, which much of the base might not have been into. I would argue that much of her rhetoric at the Democratic National Convention in August was more suited for a moderate Republican than a Democrat. She talked about securing borders, having a strong military. She avoided addressing identity politics. She campaigned with Liz Cheney. One of her biggest things she would talk about was how she was supported by the Republican establishment, and most alarmingly, she refused to engage with any talk of ending the United States' role in the ongoing genocide in Palestine. In the aftermath of her loss, many pundits and insiders have came out to make accusations that her campaign wasn't very good and the groundwork strategy was flawed. Some point out that the way she got the nomination was problematic to begin with. There's a whole lot of things to criticize about Kamala's strategy before you even begin to consider how this strategy was either informed by or was structured to deal with the fact that she was a Black woman. Since the election, I've talked to a lot of Black women, and one thing that's been said to me multiple times is that as a Black woman in these types of spaces, it doesn't matter what you say or do or what you say you're going to do. You will always be received as woke and emotional and inherently incompetent and all these things. And one could argue that the conservatism of her campaign was an effort to counteract that natural narrative, a narrative that if you look at exit polls, she definitely seemed to stick to her despite her flawed campaign. And I'm not saying that to say that her campaign was good. I'm just saying it helps explain one of the reasons why it was the way it was. However, this doesn't seem to matter when you look at the data. When you zoom in from the national level and just look at the 7 key swing states that really decided this election, you begin to really get some answers. For those unaware or outside the US, our presidential elections are some bullshit low key. The country has 50 states, right? And each state is worth a certain amount of points. If you win that state by getting the most votes in that state, you get all 20 points. Even if you only got 51% of the vote, you still get all 20 points. What this ends up doing is making it so 5 to 10 states that are up for grabs really control the entire election. And that's because most states in America consistently vote in a very specific way. Some states like Minnesota, for example, haven't voted for a Republican for president since 1968. States like Texas, on the other hand, haven't voted for a Democrat since 1972. This means that any analysis of the election that doesn't hyper-focus on what happened in those states isn't necessarily the greatest analysis, because in those states is where the voting population has and feels the most responsibility. This is where campaigns spend the most money, and this is where the campaign's successes or failures are really reflected and where data and feedback is most valuable. So that's where I'm going to focus most of my analysis on. And when you focus the analysis on the 7 battleground states, you start to see some really interesting features. In 2024, there were 7 battleground states: North Carolina, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, and Wisconsin. Kamala Harris lost all of them. However, the narrative that I presented a second ago about her flawed campaign, that voters stayed home because she ran too far to the right and didn't support Palestine, that she didn't run on any policies, etc., that doesn't really hold up here, because in 4 of the 7 swing states, Wisconsin, Georgia, North Carolina, and Nevada, Kamala Harris actually outdid Joe Biden in 2020. Now, it's from small numbers. It's not like she outdid him by a whole lot. But considering that Joe Biden had 7 million more votes nationwide, the fact that Kamala Harris kept up with him in these 4 battleground states indicates that she wasn't doing nearly as bad as people are trying to say she was. And in the 3 states where she didn't outdo him, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Arizona, she got within around 70,000 votes or less. So he didn't blow her out there either. Now, you may still feel that Kamala's campaign was bad because you don't like her politics or tactics on a specific personal level. And I would agree with all of those opinions. However, that doesn't mean her campaign was ineffective. The numbers say that it was. The difference is in Trump and some of the specific voter bases that he was able to pull in those same states, as well as specific voters that did not show up for Harris that showed up for Biden. While all the criticisms that you probably have of Harris and her campaign are true, I still think the results are more consistent with this country's deep-rooted misogyny and racism. I know people don't like that. So let me address some of the common arguments that I've seen against this take. So one of the main things I've seen is that Kamala lost because of abstainers and third-party voters, most of which who had the genocide in Palestine as a deal breaker. All that said, very little data points to those people having a significant effect. The most prominent third-party candidate left to Kamala who did not support the genocide was Jill Stein. And in no swing state did Stein get even a full 1% of the vote. In Wisconsin and Georgia, she didn't even come in third. I know some truly principled leftists actually voted for Donald Trump in protests, which, okay. But I seriously doubt that that was enough to really make the difference here to put the loss on Stein and protest voters. You could argue that more principled anti-genocide voters just stayed home, but that would clash with the aforementioned fact that turnout was up in swing states. Stein did her best in Michigan, where there is a large Muslim population, where there was also a well-organized effort against the Harris campaign because of her response to the genocide. But even in Michigan, if you add all of Stein's votes to Kamala's, she would still lose. This is important to point out for a few reasons, but for the moment, I really wanted to sink in with liberals and moderates who have went full mask off online with their vitriol towards the people of Palestine and the anti-genocide movement. In the days and weeks after the election, many on social media pointed at Palestinians and their supporters as the cause to Harris's loss, and it was gross and abhorrent to witness. People posted videos of them going to Starbucks, which, by the way, Starbucks was never actually involved in any boycott related to Palestine. That's just a significant marker of how uninformed a lot of us are online, myself included. But regardless of whether or not Starbucks was a part of the anti-Palestine movement, the fact that people were going there explicitly to spite Palestinians, that shit is whack. That shit is fucked up. All you should be ashamed of yourselves. People argued, well, these folks are just angry and they should be allowed to vent their anger and express their emotions without being judged. And sure, maybe, but in that regard, where is that same empathy for Palestinians who are actively being bombed right now? Of all the things that came out of the election, this was the most disappointing to me because I genuinely expected better. And in some situations, I don't know why I did. But I'll come back to this. Another thing that people point out is that certain progressive ballot measures won in states that Kamala lost. For example, in Arizona and Nevada, they established a state right to abortion. This even won in the deep red state of Missouri. And in these particular situations, progressive ballot measures won big time, sometimes getting more votes than Trump and Harris in a particular state. So this would be a good argument against the misogyny and racism issue if you don't actually understand the difference between progressive politics and progressive policies. Many people will point out that progressive policies like universal health care, gun control, abortion, all tend to be popular issues that most of the nation agrees upon. The problem there is how these issues are seen if they're connected to or in any way can be seen as supporting of Black people, people who are seen as undeserving. Whenever an issue is connected to Black people in this country, white people will vote against that issue essentially out of spite. Right now, they're trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which is known to white people, a specific type of white people, as Obamacare. These are people that will literally lose their health care if Obamacare is repealed, but because it has the name Obama on it, they do not care, or they don't care enough to actually know what will happen to them. And we've seen this historically in America. The easiest example comes from the history of programs such as the New Deal or the GI Bill. Both of these programs provided massive subsidies, social welfare, and handouts to predominantly white people across the country, enabling the largest growth of the middle class in modern history, but only for white people, as both these programs were greatly impossible to access for African Americans. And when people started even hinting at the idea that African Americans should start to benefit from these programs, public opinion on these programs changed. People started looking at them as welfare and handouts to the undeserving. And all of these programs saw drastic cuts in subsequent years. White Americans were fine with cutting off their own well-being if it meant that Black Americans were cut off too. There's an old saying that a white man will shit in his own pants just to make a Black man smell it. Moving on. Split ticket wins for Democrats in Senate and governorship seats don't prove anything regarding Kamala Harris's candidacy and campaign. One of the more frustrating arguments I've encountered is people saying that you can't call it racism or sexism because Ilhan Omar won her election in Michigan, or these two other Black women won in Maryland and Delaware. Further, Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and North Carolina had Senate or gubernatorial victories for Democrats, but those states did not go for Kamala Harris. How can you call it racism and sexism when other Black women and other Democrats were supported in situations where Kamala was not? Again, this sounds like a sound argument until you go back to look at the data of what actually happened. The first one is easy. Ilhan Omar is a House representative from Minnesota's 5th District, a deep blue district in a state that, again, hasn't voted for a Republican for president since 1968, meaning that Kamala still won it in 2024. You can't compare Ilhan to Kamala because once Ilhan Omar won her primary, her re-election was basically a formality. There was already a world of support for her against any Republican opponent. She won with less than 300,000 votes. There's no comparing these two races on scale alone, let alone the fact that that was an easy mode win for both of them. The same can be said for the Black women that ran as Democrats in Delaware and Maryland. In any situation where you're in a deep blue state, just like I explained with the Electoral College a second ago, you pretty much know who's always going to be in power in that state based off that population. Of Black people elected as senators in the United States, historically, the only Democrat to win in a non-deep blue state is Raphael Warnock here in Georgia. And that's partially because he's here in Georgia. Things are changing here. The rest are either Black Republicans or winning in states like Illinois, New Jersey, California, etc. And again, neither of these Black women, Lisa Blunt Rochester in Maryland or Angela Also Brooks in Delaware, won their seats in non-deep blue states. Not to take anything away from those sisters, it's just not the same level of difficulty or scrutiny that Harris faced as president. So what about Tommy Baldwin in Wisconsin or Jackie Rosa in Nevada, two swing states that were victories for Democrats? Surely this indicates something uniquely bad about Kamala and her campaign strategy, but again, not from the data, from the way I see it. In both of those states, Kamala Harris got more votes than the senatorial candidates. She even got more votes in Michigan than Erica Slotson, who won a Senate seat there, where she had the most resistance from the left and from Muslim protesters. She did get literally a few hundred votes less than Tommy Baldwin in Wisconsin, and it does look like she won't get more votes than Ruben Gallo in Arizona, who seems like he's going to win that seat. And she also didn't beat the incumbent Democratic governor of North Carolina, but there's some very significant reasons why that was always going to be a blowout win for the Dems there. But overall, in these other high stakes elections, it doesn't point to a unique rejection of Kamala by her voter base for any reason that would align with some of the criticism I mentioned earlier. In fact, almost all of those candidates ran with the same type of policies that Kamala did. Overall, she did great in the swing states. And had she just won the states where she did outdo Joe Biden, she would be the president right now. But she didn't, because Donald Trump significantly outdid his own performance from 4 years ago. And once we get into those numbers, it forces us to face some really hard realities. So let's return to those Senate races in Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona, and especially Pennsylvania, because they also tell us some other things once you look at the numbers. The voter results in these races, to me, point to the most important detail about what really happened in this election. Again, Kamala lost all of these states, but outside of Pennsylvania and Arizona, she outdid Biden's performance. Further, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona were Senate wins for Democrats. This means that not only did Trump win these states, not only did he outdo Biden's numbers in most of them in 2020, but he also outdid his own Republican running mates in these same states, because Trump would win the state, but Democrats would win the Senate. And the gaps here are pretty significant margins. As of writing, in Wisconsin, Trump got 1,697,769 votes and won the state. The Republican senatorial candidate got 1,641,181 votes, a significant but not so wide margin akin to how Kamala did in similar situations. In Michigan, Trump got 2,814,316 votes. The Republican candidate got 2,691,621 votes, a pretty significant gap. In Arizona, Trump got 1,764,862 votes. The Republican candidate got 1,591,318 votes. Again, another significant gap. In Nevada, Trump got 751,205 votes. The Republican candidate there got 677,046 votes, a significant gap considering the size of the state. And in Pennsylvania, the one place where a Republican actually won their race on a split ticket, Trump got 3,538,989 votes, and the Republican senatorial candidate got 3,395,274 votes. Again, a large gap in a state where the Republican actually won. This pattern is replete nationwide with Trump in solid red states. There are millions of people nationwide that went into a voting booth on election day with no interest in voting for any other candidate on their ballot other than Donald Trump. They checked one box and then turned their ballot in. Now, this isn't something that never happens. Federal elections always have higher turnout, but it's significant to see the scale at which the nation, or more explicitly, people in these swing states showed up for the old racist, adulterous, treasonous, rapist felon, as opposed to the black woman district attorney who branded herself as a cop. So who are these people? You already fucking know. Like, why? Well, I shouldn't have to make this fucking video. The data I've seen indicates that there are white men in the suburbs and rural areas. I even had Nicholas Nameless help me out by doing a spreadsheet of all the counties in these swing states just to make sure this was true. NBC's exit polls also show that among white voters in key states, Kamala lost marginally suburban voters and significantly rural voters. These are almost categorically white voters, which correlates to her vote numbers amongst whites. In those key battleground states, she only got 37% of white men and 45% of white women. When you look at the proportion of the vote she got in those areas compared to Biden, they shrink in almost every situation, which meant that Trump got to run up the score, which meant that even though she got close in many of those states, she couldn't get over the hump. There's so much talk about, how Trump gained with Latino voters, including Latino men. And there was a ton still of stupid and erroneous talk about Kamala losing black men, which is frustrating because I've been saying how that's bullshit for years now. And anyone who understands politics knows that that wasn't going to happen. If there's one silver lining to the failure of this election is that it might finally put to rest that talking point among a lot of people, specifically black women. In an interesting turn of events, Asian women actually voted more for Trump than Kamala, which is not true for Asian men. I'll let you come up with your own conclusions there, or maybe don't bother. Don't bother to even bother the Asian women or the Latino men or the black men. Do not waste your time. Because at the end of the day, white people make up 75% of America's electorate. And no Democratic candidate has won the white vote since Lyndon B. Johnson in 1968. The Democratic presidents that have won since then have won with a strong showing amongst whites and an even stronger showing amongst minorities. That is how they win the election. It's never the will of the white people of this country to allow a Democrat to be president, not in the last almost 60 years. I don't understand how what I'm saying here is controversial. If you are trying to understand the political reality of the United States of America, then all you're really doing is trying to understand the politics of what motivates white people to vote and be politically active. And I can only guess as to why a large portion of 76 million people who are white voted for Donald Trump. But more significantly, why in those swing states that won him the election, where he got more votes than his Republican counterparts by a wide margin from people who are not politically engaged, I can only assume that they felt something specific for Donald Trump that they didn't feel for Kamala Harris. And considering that this is a president who accused Haitian immigrants of eating people's pets and is threatening to use the American military on American soil to contribute to mass deportation, I don't know what motivated the motherfuckers at all. You tell me. If you can't tell, I'm really frustrated with how people are so dismissive of the role that racism and misogyny played here. Trump made incremental gains with almost every minority category. I want to point that out, right? Black men, black women, Latinos, Asians, and so many other folks, Small gains for Trump. That probably is significant in terms of the margins for which he won. But for the most part, in those swing states where Kamala did nearly as well or better than Biden, the big change here is that her voter base in suburban and rural areas actually drops compared to Biden. The percentage difference between Trump versus Biden and Trump versus Harris in rural and suburban counties widens. Harris only doesn't get blown out because she was able to turn out large numbers of voters in urban areas, aka black people and white liberals, the same voter base that many on the left are accusing of her not inspiring. Now, of course, I would argue that those voters are probably more inspired to vote against Trump than to vote for Kamala. I know that's what it was like with Biden. But again, we're talking about the difference between a bad campaign and an effective one. And the only difference between her and Biden on paper is her skin color and her sex organs. Is there a version of Kamala's campaign where she ran as a change candidate, promised universal health care and to save the environment and give stimulus packages to workers that wins her the election? Maybe. I doubt it, but maybe. But when you look at the exit poll data, 92% of voters that voted for Trump said Kamala was too extreme as a leftist. They called her a communist even as she ran a center-right campaign. It's, as I said earlier, about people not actually believing the things that black women say or do, only attributing them a set of woke features. No one in this election ran on policies. Trump said on the debate stage when they asked him about repealing Obamacare, which some Trump voters didn't even know was the same thing as the Affordable Care Act, that he had thoughts of a plan. He doesn't, of course. No Republicans have a plan to replace Obamacare, but they know that talking about replacing Obamacare gets those people in their base to vote. What are they voting for? It's not policies. In some blind surveys on policies, when people got the issues based solely on what the person was going to do, these studies found that people prefer Harris's policies over Trump's almost categorically. Again, you can't tell me that Trump voters were inspired by his policies compared to Kamala's. There's no evidence that points to that. Harris did not run on some serious woke agenda. She didn't talk about race or gender hardly at all. She ducked the conversation around trans people, talked about strong borders, didn't mention the police violence or racism basically at all. She approved fracking, yet liberal pundits are trying to say she was too left and too woke anyway. So God forbid she may have actually ran a populist campaign on change like Bernie did and talk about those things that are important to her base, because she probably would have gotten even worse. But if she were Bernie, if she were a heterosexual white man, I'm confident she'd have won with exactly the same campaign strategy of not really saying much, because again, that's what Biden did in 2020. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that racism and misogyny are the only reason she lost. But when you look at the info that we have, you recognize that she lost white voters, that many white voters stayed home, and that she did well in swing states despite not having policies, and that hundreds of thousands of voters showed up in swing states explicitly to vote for Donald Trump, who also didn't have policies. She even won independents. I was surprised at that. That was something that was not true early on the election data, but in the aftermath of the election, she won independent voters. But those people that wanted what Donald Trump was selling, they came through for him and they didn't come through for Kamala. I'm a researcher by trade, but I'm not a quantitative guy. I didn't do the most rigorous analysis here. I didn't run any regression tables. I welcome those of you who have that skill set to come and look at what I've looked at and come to your own conclusion. I hope that I'm wrong, to be honest. I wish we lived in a world where American voters cared so much about Palestine that they stayed home. I wish we had a voting population in this country that cared so much about policy details that they weren't inspired to vote for a candidate who provided none. But nothing in the data points to this. And I think we on the left need to get that through our skulls. Considering everything I've shown you here, I'm genuinely asking you in the comments, please, for my own sake, for everyone's sake, find a better explanation than racism and misogyny that actually makes sense. I'm begging you to prove me wrong with something more than willful ignorance and vibes. Because the data points to Trump uniquely motivating a specific type of voter that shows up only for him, only for his unique brand of racist, sexist, authoritarian posturing. He gets rural America voting in a way they traditionally do not. Trump could have actually beaten Obama in 2008. There's people like memeing like Obama's going to come back in 2028 or whatever because Trump's going to try to run for a third term. He's going to beat Obama too if we don't fix the actual core issue that this country's dealing with. So I'm sorry if I'm heated and I'm coming off like hot to anyone, but to me, it's absurd that we're tossing out this explanation when it's the only one that actually tells us where we are as a country. There's a video from Innuendo Studios I like to talk about in these situations called There's Always a Bigger Fish. And it's to me one of the more important political videos on this platform if you want to understand what motivates the conservative mind. In this video, he argues that the embarrassed millionaire thing is inaccurate. I know a lot of people are saying conservatives vote for Republicans because they think they're going to be rich. And there's all these people that are like, Trump represents the lifestyle and ideology that I want to have, even though I work at Foot Locker and make less than $30,000 a year. He makes the argument that that's not really what it is. He argues instead that conservatives fight for power for other conservatives, not because they think that they'll be powerful one day, but because they feel like the people who have that power are supposed to have it. And they feel like people who naturally don't have power should never have it because they haven't earned it. And somehow those who do have power did earn it. And this is why Trump can get away with saying that he started from a small loan of $1 million and had so many conservatives be okay with that. And this is what Trump presents to the world, this populist strongman figure that puts everyone in their place and cannot be controlled or held accountable in any way. This is why he had to say the previous election was stolen. And even as he faced charges and was convicted on some of these charges, it doesn't make a difference. It's why his assassination attempt was a huge deal for him. And the media and everyone else just keeps letting him get away with it. No matter how dumb he looks, no matter how little some of the things he says make sense, it doesn't matter because he's Donald Trump and he can get away with it. But you know who doesn't get away with anything in America ever? Black people, especially black women. No group is more required to know their place and know their lack of worth in this country than black women. The double standards for women become quadruple standards for black women. Beyonce didn't even get nominated for a country music award. What the hell made you think that we were going to elect a black woman as president of the whole country, even in 2024? I'm sure you can pull out some surveys that say more left-leaning people would have voted for her if she endorsed a ceasefire or ran a more left-wing campaign. And of course, her decision to campaign with Liz Cheney and all the other bullshit wasn't good. And I want to again be clear. Kamala wasn't that great of a candidate to begin with. In 2020, she was the first candidate to drop out. Do y'all remember that? For 4 years as vice president, she didn't do much to impress or inspire. And if the Democrats had a primary this time around, she probably would have lost to Amy Klobuchar or her own running mate, Tim Walz, or likely the next Democratic winner, if you want to put money on it, the American Psycho himself, Gavin Newsom. All of this is true, but that's not what happened. What happened is she ran and she almost won 4 swing states, and she lost because Trump brought out his squad. And his squad are rural Americans greatly unified behind some very, very specific interests. The reason I bothered to do this work is because I really need those to the right of me to stop blaming the far left for this loss. The numbers show we didn't do much. You're showing your own true colors with the way you're responding to this loss. You're proving everything we say about you to be true by pointing the finger at Palestinians, Latinos, and black men instead of some of your own cousins and husbands who have the real impact here. We barely had any impact at all. I also need those to my left to get a reality check because we barely had any impact at all. We are much further from our goals than many online like to believe. I'd argue that much of our behavior online, from the infighting to the purity testing to the constant engagement with rage bait, is a core reason why we're not nearly as far along as we think we are. We're chasing the feeling of winning something, anything, and getting it with mean tweets and comments while nothing is actually getting done outside of our screens. This isn't everyone to my left. You know who you are. But it's some of you, and you know who you are too. This election's results are beholding to the same massive forces that American politics have always been beholden to. White supremacist patriarchy in its varied and most subtle forms. Again, if you don't see the role that racism and misogyny played in this situation, I invite you to present your best argument in the comments. But then after that, tell me what you're doing next. One of the reasons I voted for Kamala is because I wanted to avoid making a video like this because I knew as soon as she started losing that I was probably going to have to make something like this. Because while Kamala represents a horrible status quo that I've been talking about from jump, to again be clear where I stand. To me, there's value in not resetting the meta of what resistance looks like to the institutions that both Trump and Harris really work for. I might be wrong about this. This is not a hill I'll die on. In fact, if you look at like the person that Trump just appointed as his borders are, that same guy that people are crying about worked for Barack Obama. Like, people that say that you can't compare the two, you're lying to yourselves. But anyway, in the aftermath of this election, the whole game has been reset. We're putting effort into settling down foaming at the mouth liberals who are going full mask off with Zionism, imperialism. We're also dealing with charged up conservatives preparing for the Christo-fascist regime that Trump is trying to put in place. Resources that may have went to further resistance for Palestine are going to be used to fight under the Muslim ban here in the United States. Bad immigrant policy that we already had is going to be leveled up to militarized mass deportation. And this isn't even getting into the drastic changes that will likely face LGBTQ people and especially trans people going forward. And I'm not saying all this to prepare for a future I told you so, because at the end of the day, Kamala and the Democratic Party deserve exactly what they get. They are bad for all the reasons we know them to be bad. And all the things we're complaining about are exactly why they're bad. So they deserve it, but we don't. So what are you going to do about it? After you leave your comment of approval or your comment of disapproval, what are you going to do next? What meeting do you have on your calendar? Have you reached out to your neighbors to see who you can coalition build with? Are you capable of protecting yourself or others? What are you doing besides watching my videos? I don't know what should be done next. I'm just a creative. I'm not a leader or an organizer. I'm barely affiliated myself. But I will tell you, regardless of what you think of this video's thesis and me, now that the election is over, neither of those things are all that important. Whatever work you are doing or planning to do while supporting or resisting a Kamala Harris presidency, you should be doing the same exact thing under Trump. You need to wrangle whatever loose threads you have developed from this, get over whatever it is that you're needing to get over, and get back to work in whatever way you can. So in support of that, the pinned comment of this video will be used as a place to list organizing opportunities and networks of support. Please be responsible, as this is a Google platform that is public. None of this is secure, but if you have a safe way to share an org that you want to support and pull people into, please list them there. Contact info for them, location, etc. in that pinned comment. Please put nothing else in that comment because I don't want it to get bogged down with debate. Feel free to broaden that discussion elsewhere in the comments, or if you're still not with me in my explanation, explain why. Again, I hope I look stupid. I hope this video ages really poorly because I'm just so fucking wrong about American politics. Please show me how I'm wrong. For what it's worth, I'm praying for everyone to win regardless. That's all I got for today, y'all. No sponsor for this one. Peace, I'm out.